Madeline Carter was 32 years old when she pulled a car into the long driveway of the house where she had grown up. The drive from the city had taken nearly 6 hours through steady winter traffic and patches of falling snow. Her arms ached as she lifted the car seat from the back seat. Inside it, her 9-month-old daughter, Ava, was finally asleep. The baby's small face was peaceful, her breath slow and warm against the blanket. Madeline stood on the porch for a moment, steadying herself. Christmas lights glowed along the roofline, and the smell of pine drifted from the wreath hanging on the door. She had imagined this moment during the entire drive, walking into a warm house, hearing laughter, letting her parents hold their granddaughter for the first time in months. She wanted something simple. A normal Christmas. She knocked gently with one hand while balancing the heavy carrier with the other. Before I continue, I want to take a moment to thank everyone who has subscribed and supported this channel. It truly means more than you know. If you haven't subscribed yet, please take a second to do so. It's completely free, and it helps the channel grow. Like this video, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. The door opened almost immediately. Her mother, Diane Carter, stood in the doorway. Diane looked at Madeline for only a second before her eyes moved down to the sleeping baby. Her expression tightened in visible irritation rather than joy. She didn't step aside. She didn't smile. "Why did you come?" she asked flatly. The cold air bit at Madeline's cheeks as she blinked in confusion. "It's Christmas, Mom," she replied quietly, trying to keep her voice calm despite the sudden sting of rejection already forming in her chest. Diane didn't move from the doorway. Instead, she folded her arms and glanced again at the baby carrier as if it were an inconvenience placed on her porch. "Your baby makes people uncomfortable," she said bluntly, as though she were commenting on the weather. Madeline stood frozen, unsure she had heard correctly. Snow drifted lightly across the driveway behind her. Inside the living room she could see her father, Richard Carter, sitting comfortably in his leather armchair with a football game playing on the television. He looked over briefly, noticed Madeline standing at the door, and gave a faint smirk before turning his attention back to the screen. A few seconds later her younger sister Brittany walked through the hallway carrying her phone. Brittany glanced toward the door but didn't acknowledge Madeline at all. She simply walked past as if Madeline were a delivery driver. The warmth Madeline had imagined during the drive vanished instantly. The cold wind pushed against her back as she stood there holding Ava tighter against her chest. After a long, awkward pause, Diane finally stepped aside with a sigh. "Well, come in before you let all the heat out," she muttered. Madeline walked into the house slowly, her boots leaving small wet marks on the floor. The familiar living room looked the same as always, decorated with expensive ornaments and glowing lights. Yet something about it felt strangely foreign now. Madeline stood in the entryway for several seconds, waiting for someone to greet her properly. No one did. Diane had already disappeared into the kitchen without offering to take her coat. Richard remained absorbed in the television, watching the game that was nearing halftime. Brittany sat on the couch scrolling through her phone with casual indifference. The silence made Madeline painfully aware of how heavy the car seat felt in her arms. She carefully set it down beside the hallway table so she could remove her boots. Ava stirred slightly but remained asleep. Madeline glanced around the house. The walls had been freshly painted a soft cream color, and the hardwood floors shone under the lights. She recognized every improvement immediately because she had paid for them. The painting had cost nearly $2,000 the previous summer after her mother complained that the old yellow walls gave her headaches. The floor refinishing had been another expense 2 years earlier when Brittany scratched it dragging a metal table across the room. Madeline had transferred the money without hesitation back then. Standing there now, she realized how strange it was that no one had even asked how her drive had been. No one had asked how Ava was doing. They simply assumed she would arrive the way she always did, quiet, helpful, and ready to solve their problems. It had not always been like this, at least not in a way Madeline noticed at first. The pattern had begun slowly when she was 22 and had just started her first real job after college. She remembered the call from her father clearly. Richard had sounded embarrassed and anxious as he explained that he had accidentally forgotten to pay the electric bill for several months. The power company, he said, was planning to shut off the electricity the next morning. "Can you help me just this once?" he asked. Madeline had been proud of her new job and eager to show that she was responsible. She paid the $250 bill immediately. Richard thanked her warmly, and the gratitude made her feel useful. She thought she had helped the family through a temporary problem. 2 months later Diane called in a panic about groceries. The refrigerator was empty, she said, and Brittany needed proper meals to stay healthy for her college track training. Madeline sent $500 without questioning it. After that came car repairs, insurance payments, and unexpected expenses that always seemed urgent. Each request sounded reasonable on its own. Each one came with a promise that it was only temporary. Madeline believed them because she wanted to believe her family valued her help. Over time, those emergencies stopped being rare events and became a quiet routine. If something in the house broke, Madeline was expected to fix it. If Brittany needed tuition money or a new laptop for her design classes, Madeline quietly covered the cost. The most dramatic request came 5 years earlier when Richard called late one night sounding desperate. Business had been slow, he said, and the bank was threatening foreclosure on the house. Madeline had been saving money for her own apartment at the time, carefully building a small fund after years of working long hours. Richard told her they needed $12,000 immediately to stop the foreclosure process. Madeline looked at her savings account and saw $13,000, the entire future she had been planning. Without hesitation, she transferred the money the next morning. The house was saved. For a few days she waited for something to change in the way her parents treated her. She hoped they would see her differently now, perhaps with respect or appreciation. But nothing changed. Within a week she saw photos online of her parents enjoying a weekend trip to a coastal winery, smiling in expensive restaurants as if nothing had ever been wrong. That was the first time a quiet doubt began to grow inside her, though she tried very hard to ignore it. Madeline had tried to ignore that doubt for years. She convinced herself that her parents were simply careless with money and that helping them was what responsible daughters did. But standing in the entryway that Christmas afternoon, holding her sleeping daughter while her family acted as if she barely existed, the truth felt impossible to ignore. Brittany suddenly glanced up from her phone. "Is that baby going to cry?" she asked casually without looking directly at Ava. Madeline felt her stomach tighten. "Her name is Ava," she said calmly. "And she's probably just hungry after the drive." Brittany rolled her eyes and returned to her phone. "Well, if she starts screaming, I'm going to my room. I was out late last night and I have a headache." A moment later Diane returned from the kitchen carrying a dish towel. She looked at the car seat on the floor with clear irritation. "You shouldn't leave that there," she said. "Someone could trip over it." Madeline took a slow breath. "I just got here, Mom. I'm still taking off my coat." Diane shrugged and turned away again. From the living room, Richard suddenly raised the television volume as the football announcer's voice filled the house. The game was moving toward halftime. No one asked about the 6-hour drive. No one asked how Ava was doing. In that moment Madeline began to understand something she had never fully admitted before. In this house, she was not treated like family. She was treated like a resource. Madeline lifted Ava gently from the carrier, holding her against her shoulder as the baby slowly woke up. Ava blinked her bright blue eyes at the Christmas tree lights glowing in the corner of the room and smiled softly. Madeline carried her into the living room and stood near Richard's chair. "Dad," she said, trying to sound hopeful, "look who's here." Ava waved one tiny hand toward him, a cheerful little motion that usually made strangers smile. Richard glanced briefly away from the television. Instead of smiling back, he frowned slightly. "I see her," he muttered. "But you're standing in front of the screen." Madeline stepped aside quickly. Ava's smile faded as she buried her face in her mother's shoulder. Brittany sighed loudly from the couch. "Great," she said. "Now she's going to start crying." "She's just hungry," Madeline replied. "Would anyone mind holding her for a minute while I warm her bottle?" She looked at each of them in turn. Brittany pretended not to hear. Richard remained focused on the football game as the halftime commentary began. Diane adjusted the sleeves of her blouse and shook her head. "I'm cooking," she said sharply. "I can't get baby drool on this top." Madeline nodded slowly, though disappointment stung behind her eyes. She carried Ava into the kitchen herself and warmed a bottle under the sink's hot water. As she fed her daughter quietly at the dining table, laughter drifted from the living room where the others were chatting comfortably together. From her chair in the corner of the dining room, Madeline could see the living room through the archway. Richard and Brittany were laughing at something on Brittany's phone while Diane discussed the upcoming dinner. They looked relaxed, perfectly comfortable with one another. Yet Madeline felt like a visitor sitting outside their circle. Ava drank her bottle peacefully in her arms, small fingers gripping the fabric of Madeline's sweater. Madeline's eyes drifted toward the gift bag she had placed near the front door when she arrived. She had spent hours choosing those presents despite the long drive and the demands of caring for a baby. Brittany's gift was a designer handbag she had mentioned online weeks earlier. Richard's was a new smartwatch because he had complained about his old one slowing down. Diane's gift was a luxury skincare set she had once admired at a department store.
The bags sat untouched by the door. No one had even asked what she brought.
Diane suddenly called out from the living room without turning around. Madeline, did you get that end-of-year bonus you mentioned last month?
Madeline looked down at Ava.
Yes, she replied quietly. Diane nodded as if confirming something obvious. Good. The furnace has been making awful noises lately.
We might need a new one soon.
Your father's repair guy said it could cost around $4,000. Madeline said nothing at first. Ava finished her bottle and rested her head against Madeline's chest while the words echoed in her mind. She had been inside the house for less than an hour, and already the conversation had turned to money. No one had asked about her job, her health, or the sleepless nights that came with caring for a 9-month-old baby. Diane continued speaking casually from the living room. The technician might come next week to look at it properly, she added. It would be easier if we just replaced the whole unit.
Richard chimed in from his chair.
Yeah, make sure you're ready to send the money when we know the exact cost. Madeline slowly wiped Ava's mouth with a small cloth. She looked again at the gift bags near the door. Something inside her was shifting, quietly but firmly. For years she had answered every request immediately because she believed helping them meant she belonged.
Now she saw something different.
To them, her kindness had simply become a predictable supply.
She stood up and carried Ava back toward the living room.
As she passed the doorway, Brittany glanced at her briefly. Dinner should be ready soon, Brittany said. You might want to hurry if you're going to eat before the second half of the game starts.
Dinner was served about an hour later.
Diane had set the table carefully with polished silverware and crystal glasses, presenting the meal with the same attention she always gave to appearances. Madeline unfolded the portable high chair she had brought from the car and secured it beside her chair so Ava could sit comfortably. The baby chewed happily on a small rubber teething toy while watching the candlelight flicker across the table.
Brittany glanced at the high chair with mild annoyance. Can you move her a little? She asked.
She keeps staring at me.
Madeline forced a small smile.
She's just curious. Diane served roast beef to Richard first, then to Brittany. Madeline quietly helped herself to a small portion once the dishes were passed.
As the family began eating, Richard cleared his throat.
About that furnace, he said calmly while cutting his food.
I told the technician to come Tuesday.
Just send me $400 to $500 tomorrow morning to cover the replacement and any extra parts. Diane nodded in agreement.
And Brittany is looking at apartments downtown, she added.
The deposit will probably be around $3,000, but it's a good area. Madeline slowly placed her fork on the table. The requests were delivered with complete confidence, as if the money already belonged to them. She looked from one face to another, realizing something important. They had never once asked if she could afford it.
Madeline looked around the table slowly.
Diane was calmly spreading gravy across her mashed potatoes. Richard chewed his roast beef as if he had just asked her to pass the salt. Brittany scrolled through her phone between bites of food, barely paying attention to the conversation. The casual confidence in their voices made something inside Madeline tighten.
For years she had answered requests like this automatically. She had transferred money before even thinking about it. But now Ava sat beside her, happily tapping her toy against the tray of the high chair. Madeline could hear the soft little sounds her daughter made as she explored the room with curious eyes. Suddenly the numbers her parents had mentioned sounded very different. $400 to $500 for a furnace. $3,000 for Brittany's apartment deposit. Nearly $8,000 decided without even asking her. Madeline realized she was holding her breath. Slowly she let it out and rested both hands on the table. The room felt strangely quiet despite the clinking of silverware. She thought about the 6-hour drive through snow. She thought about the way Ava had been ignored since they arrived. She thought about the years of bank transfers and silent expectations. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm but firm. No, she said quietly. The word hung in the air like a sudden crack of thunder. Richard paused with his fork halfway to his mouth. Diane slowly turned her head toward Madeline as if she had misheard. Brittany looked up from her phone with visible confusion. What did you say? Richard asked, lowering his fork. Madeline met his eyes steadily. Her heart was beating fast, but her voice did not shake this time. I said no, she repeated. I'm not paying for the furnace, and I'm not paying for Brittany's apartment. For several seconds no one spoke. Then Brittany let out a short laugh of disbelief. You're joking, right? She said. Mom already told me you were helping. Madeline shook her head slowly. I never promised that. Diane's expression hardened immediately. Madeline, don't start being selfish now, she said sharply. Family helps family. You have a good job in the city. Your sister is trying to become independent.
Madeline glanced at Ava, who was still quietly playing with her toy.
I have a child now, Madeline replied calmly. My responsibility is to her.
I can't keep supporting everyone else.
Richard leaned back in his chair with a heavy sigh.
Don't use the baby as an excuse, he said bluntly. You're acting stingy. You show up here with that crying kid and disrupt Christmas, and now you're refusing to help your own family. Madeline felt a familiar wave of frustration rise in her chest, but this time she didn't swallow it.
She sat up straighter in her chair.
Everything in this house has been helped by me, she said quietly but clearly.
I paid for the paint on the walls.
I paid to refinish the floors.
I paid the mortgage when you said the bank was about to foreclose.
I've spent years sending money whenever you called.
Diane's face flushed red. That's what daughters do, she snapped.
We raised you. We sacrificed for you.
Madeline shook her head slowly. No, she said.
You treated me like an ATM.
Brittany scoffed loudly and rolled her eyes.
Oh my God, listen to her, she muttered.
Is this postpartum depression or something? You sound dramatic. Richard pointed toward Madeline's chair.
Sit down and stop making a scene, he said sharply. You're ruining dinner.
Madeline pushed her chair back and stood up.
The legs scraped loudly across the floor. Ava looked up at her with wide, curious eyes but remained calm. Madeline took a deep breath before speaking again.
I'm not ruining dinner, she said quietly.
I'm telling the truth. She looked at each of them carefully, seeing something she had ignored for years. There was no concern in their expressions, only irritation that the conversation had changed. I drove 6 hours today hoping we could spend Christmas together, she continued.
Not one of you asked how the drive was. Not one of you asked how your granddaughter is doing.
The first real conversation we had was about money.
Diane folded her arms defensively. You're overreacting, she said coldly.
You always get emotional when you're tired.
Brittany laughed again under her breath. She'll calm down tomorrow, she said casually.
She always does. Madeline felt something inside her settle into a quiet certainty.
For the first time in years she wasn't afraid of their disappointment. She wasn't afraid of their silence either. I'm done, Madeline said.
The words came out clearly and without hesitation. I'm done paying for everything.
Richard stared at her as if she had just spoken another language. Diane shook her head dismissively. You say that now, she replied. But you'll transfer the money tomorrow.
You always feel guilty later.
Brittany picked up her fork again and continued eating. Yeah, she added with a smirk.
You always come around. Madeline looked at them one last time, noticing how certain they were that nothing had truly changed.
That certainty finally made her decision easy.
Without another word she turned away from the table and walked toward Ava's high chair. The baby smiled up at her as Madeline gently unbuckled the straps and lifted her into her arms. Ava rested her head against Madeline's shoulder, calm and trusting. Madeline held her daughter close for a moment before walking toward the front door. As she passed the entryway, she reached down and picked up the gift bag she had brought with her, the designer handbag for Brittany, the smartwatch for Richard, and the skincare set for Diane. If they didn't want her or her daughter, they wouldn't get the gift she had chosen either. Madeline slipped the handles of the gift bags over her arm while holding Ava securely against her shoulder.
The movement finally caught Diane's attention. Where are you going? Her mother asked sharply from the dining room. Madeline didn't raise her voice when she answered.
I'm leaving.
Richard pushed his chair back with irritation. Don't be ridiculous, he said. It's snowing outside.
Madeline calmly picked up Ava's car seat from beside the hallway table and set it on the floor so she could place the baby inside. Ava blinked up at her mother, quiet and trusting. Madeline fastened the straps carefully. I'd rather deal with snow than stay somewhere I'm not welcome, she said.
Brittany laughed from the table.
You're being dramatic again. Diane walked toward the hallway with visible frustration. If you walk out that door tonight, she warned, don't expect us to chase after you when you regret it. Madeline zipped Ava's winter suit and lifted the car seat once more. Then she turned to face them one last time.
I won't regret it, she said calmly.
I should have stopped this years ago.
Without another word, she opened the door.
A gust of icy wind rushed into the house as snow swirled across the dark driveway.
The walk to the car was quick but brutal.
The cold air stung Madeline's face as she stepped through the thick snow covering the driveway. She placed the gift bags on the passenger seat before securing Ava's car seat in the back. Ava watched quietly as her mother fastened the buckles and tucked the blanket around her. "We're going home," Madeline whispered softly, kissing her forehead. The baby blinked up at her and reached out with one tiny hand. Madeline climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine. The house lights glowed behind her, and for a moment she saw the curtain in the living room window move. Someone inside was watching, probably expecting her to come back after a few minutes. Instead, she shifted the car into reverse and backed slowly out of the driveway. Snowflakes struck the windshield as the wipers moved steadily back and forth. The road ahead was dark and uncertain, but Madeline felt a strange calm settle in her chest. For years she had carried the weight of everyone else's expectations. Tonight she was finally putting it down. The 6-hour drive back to the city was slow and tense. Snow covered parts of the highway, forcing Madeline to keep both hands firmly on the steering wheel while the car moved carefully through the storm. Ava slept peacefully in the back seat for most of the trip, the soft rhythm of the road rocking her gently. Once the car slipped slightly on a patch of black ice, but Madeline corrected it quickly and continued forward with steady focus. She didn't cry. She didn't panic. Instead, she felt a quiet clarity growing with every mile. For years she had driven through life trying to keep everyone else comfortable while ignoring her own exhaustion. Now the storm outside felt almost symbolic of everything she had been navigating emotionally. When she finally reached her apartment complex close to 2 in the morning, the snow had begun to slow. The parking lot was quiet. Madeline carried Ava upstairs, unlocked the door, and stepped into the familiar warmth of her small apartment. The space smelled faintly of lavender and clean laundry. It was peaceful, and for the first time that day, she felt safe. Madeline placed Ava gently in her bassinet beside the couch and sank into the rocking chair nearby. Her phone buzzed repeatedly on the coffee table. When she finally looked at it, she saw several missed calls and messages from her family. Diane had left 2 voicemails demanding that she call back immediately. Brittany had sent a string of angry texts calling her selfish and dramatic. Richard had written a short message telling her to stop acting childish and send the furnace money. Madeline stared at the screen for a moment before placing the phone face down on the table. For the first time in years, she didn't feel the urge to respond. Instead, she watched Ava sleeping peacefully in the bassinet. The small apartment was silent except for the gentle hum of the heater. Madeline realized something she had avoided admitting for a long time. She had already been alone for years. The only difference now was that she had finally stopped pretending otherwise. The realization didn't frighten her. It felt like relief. 2 quiet days passed. Madeline spent them resting, playing with Ava on the living room floor, and catching up on sleep she had been missing for months. The tension she had carried for years slowly began to fade. On the morning of the 3rd day, a firm knock sounded at the apartment door. Madeline froze for a moment as she poured coffee in the kitchen. Ava sat in a small swing nearby, kicking her legs happily. Madeline walked to the door and looked through the peephole. Her stomach tightened immediately. Diane, Richard, and Brittany stood outside in the hallway brushing snow from their coats. Diane was holding a plastic container of food, and Richard carried a bottle of wine. Brittany even appeared to be smiling. Madeline hesitated, considering whether to open the door at all. A part of her still wanted to believe they had come to apologize. After a long pause, she unlocked the deadbolt and opened the door slightly. "Surprise," Diane said cheerfully, stepping forward as if nothing unusual had happened. "We thought we'd come see you and the baby." Before Madeline could respond, Diane stepped inside the apartment as if she had been invited. Richard followed, setting the wine bottle on the small kitchen counter while Brittany kicked off her boots near the door. The apartment suddenly felt crowded. Diane looked around the living room with a polite smile that felt strangely rehearsed. "This place is nice," she said, though her tone suggested she found it smaller than she expected. Ava watched the newcomers from her swing, curious but quiet. Diane leaned down and waved a finger near the baby's face. "Hello there," she said softly, though she didn't pick her up. Richard opened the refrigerator and glanced at the shelves before closing it again. Brittany flopped onto the couch as if she had always lived there. "We felt bad about Christmas," Diane said, turning back to Madeline with a practiced expression of concern. "Everyone was stressed, and things got heated." Richard nodded. "The holidays make people say things they don't mean." Madeline listened silently, studying their faces. No one said the words "I'm sorry." Instead, they spoke carefully, like people trying to smooth over a business disagreement. For a moment, Madeline allowed herself to hope that maybe they had come to repair the damage. She offered them coffee, and they sat together talking about neighbors, television shows, and minor family gossip as if nothing serious had happened at all. After about an hour, Diane stood up. "I should use your restroom before we head back," she said, leaving her purse and phone on the coffee table. Richard wandered into the kitchen again while Brittany stood near the door putting on her coat. Madeline sat on the couch holding Ava when Diane's phone suddenly lit up with a new message. The screen faced upward, and the preview was impossible to miss. The message was from Brittany. Madeline glanced toward the hallway where Diane had gone, then back toward Brittany near the door.
Brittany was looking down at her own phone with a faint smirk.
Madeline's eyes returned to the glowing screen. The message read clearly, "See? I told you she'd fold. Ask about the furnace money before we leave." The words seemed to freeze the air in the room. In an instant every polite conversation from the past hour made sense.
The sudden friendliness. The casual visit.
The careful smiles. None of it had been about reconciliation.
It had been strategy.
Madeline quietly looked away from the phone before Diane returned from the hallway. Diane picked up her purse with a pleasant smile. "Well," she said brightly, "this was lovely. It feels good to have things back to normal."
She paused expectantly.
Richard cleared his throat. "About that furnace," he began. Madeline stood slowly, holding Ava against her shoulder. Her voice was calm and steady when she spoke. "I spent my bonus already," she said. The statement was simple but final. Diane's smile vanished instantly. "You spent it?"
Brittany asked sharply. Richard frowned in disbelief. Madeline nodded.
"Every dollar went into a savings account for Ava's future." The room fell silent. Diane's expression hardened. "That was irresponsible," she said coldly. "You should have discussed it with us."
Madeline shook her head gently. "It's my money," she replied.
Richard grabbed his coat without another word and walked toward the door. Brittany followed, glaring as she passed. "Thanks for nothing," she muttered. Diane lingered for a moment, studying Madeline with clear disappointment. "You've changed," she said.
Madeline met her gaze calmly. "No," she answered.
"I finally stopped being used." Diane turned and left without saying goodbye to Ava.
Madeline closed the door behind them and locked it. The apartment grew quiet again.
Ava rested her head on Madeline's shoulder, completely unaware of the tension that had just passed. Madeline carried her to the window and looked out at the falling snow. For years she had believed family meant obligation no matter the cost.
Now she understood something different. Real family wasn't defined by who demanded the most from you.
It was defined by who cared enough to stand beside you without expecting anything in return. Holding Ava close, Madeline felt a deep sense of peace settle over her life. For the first time in years, her future, and her daughter's future, truly belonged to them.
Thank you for watching until the end.
Madeline finally chose peace over pressure and protected the future she wanted for her daughter. Sometimes the hardest thing to do is walk away from people who believe they are entitled to your life.
What would you have done if you were in Madeline's place? Let me know in the comments.
If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more powerful stories.